Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, a conversation with Frank Cooper, Senior Managing Director and Global Chief Marketing Officer at BlackRock. This afternoon's webinar is part of the Georgetown McDonough Stanton Distinguished Leader Series. My name is Stephanie Martineau. I'm the Director of Events here at Georgetown McDonough. Before we get started with today's event, I'd like to share just a few webinar tips and reminders. This webinar's broadcast is being recorded. The recording will be made available on Georgetown McDonough's YouTube channel soon after today's broadcast. Our panelists will take a few questions towards the end of today's program. Thank you to those who have already submitted your questions. Please feel free to send in questions throughout the conversation using the Q&A function towards the bottom of your screen. If you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, feel free to also submit concerns to our tech center through the Q&A feature as well. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dean Paul Almeida, William R. Berkley Chair and Professor of Strategy and International Business. Over to you, Dean Almeida.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Stanton Distinguished Leader Series lecture with our guest, Frank Cooper of BlackRock. Welcome, Frank. Established by Dan and Mary Stanton, the parents of two Georgetown McDonough alumni, our Stanton series connects the Georgetown McDonough community with renowned executives who share stories about leadership in an ever-changing world. At Georgetown McDonough, we have designed our programs to prepare students to deal with complex issues facing business and society. And we also want to help them learn and develop the tools, techniques, mindsets, and confidence to adapt and lead in a dynamic world. Our Jesuit tradition calls for us to care holistically for people, whether they be at school, in our families, and we have to care for them throughout their careers. We appreciate the opportunity to host Frank Cooper today to connect our mission to the idea of finding purpose in our work and in our lives. While this is always important, it's especially important now when we're all dealing with a virtual environment. And this environment makes connecting with our organizations and co-workers and stakeholders even more difficult. I hope today's event helps all of us be more mindful of incorporating purpose in our lives now and in the future. Our guest, Frank Cooper, has built his career on unique capability to unite business, human and cultural perspectives to make brands supremely relevant. He has built a reputation as an agent of change and has been able to lead the transformation of companies across multiple industries, from entertainment and consumer goods to technology and finance. In his current role as Senior Managing Director and Global Chief Marketing Officer of financial powerhouse BlackRock, Frank leads the company's marketing across every region of the world, combining the science of data-driven, technology-centered approaches with the art of creativity, culture, and purpose. Frank began his career as an entertainment lawyer, later serving as a senior executive at two of the world's most iconic music labels, Motown and Def Jam. His ability to leverage entertainment to connect culture with consumers led to subsequent roles as Chief Marketing and Creative Officer at BuzzFeed and Chief Marketing Officer of Global Consumer Engagement for PepsiCo's Global Beverage Group. More recently, Frank has been lauded by Fast Company magazine as one of the 100 most creative people in business. He was a 4-time recipient of Billboard magazine's Power 100 and a recipient of AdColor's coveted Legend Award. Additionally, I personally am very grateful to Frank for bringing his vast expertise to Georgetown in an advisory role to our new analytics, technology, and Future of Work initiative, which is led by Professor Jason Schlotzer. As one of the several initiatives around preparing our students to lead in the fields of the future, this initiative will both prepare leaders to adapt to the rapid advances in how we use technology in the workplace, from AI to machine learning to data visualization and analytics, as well as the human side of how these capabilities affect how we work. I look forward to our conversation today, and I'm pleased to turn the program over to our moderator, Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs, Rebecca Hamilton, who is also our Robin G. and Robin Pasaros Chair in Business Administration and a Professor of Marketing. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Frank, we really appreciate your time today to have this conversation about purpose-driven organizations and purpose in crisis.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and love Georgetown. I'm excited about working in an advisory capacity, and I love this topic. So thank you for the invitation.
Great, welcome. Well, let me start by asking, what is a purpose-driven organization? How is purpose different from other terms we hear like mission, ESG, CSR?
Yeah, it's a great question because, as a marketer, what I've seen over the years is whatever term du jour is in the marketplace, it will eventually be abused and tortured and at some point become meaningless, right? And purpose is at risk of that because I see many people using it in ways that I don't believe is consistent with what purpose really is. To me, purpose is distinct from mission, because mission is what you do as a company, tends to be industry specific. This is what we do within the industry. I see it get confused at times with principles, but that's how a company accomplishes something, how it does it. Purpose is your why. Why do you exist in society? What human need are you filling? And if it's used correctly, it becomes the ultimate goal of the company. And so if you remember going way back, Simon Sinek did start with why, that golden circle of what, how, why, very similar to that. But here's the difference for me. When you get to the why, and the reason it differs from philanthropy or CSR or cause marketing, when you get to that why, purpose is embedded in the operating model of the company itself. That's the difference. It's not a side show. It's not benevolence on the side. It is built into the core model. And Rebecca, as I see it, over time, this has been somewhat of a renaissance, to be honest with you, because I think we started off with having a sense of kind of moral obligation as companies to society. But if you get to this 20th century, we've forgotten that. And we kind of worked our way back into it. We started with philanthropy. There's a sense that people had, corporations, you should do something in the world that is humanitarian as a corporate citizen. Then we started to do cause marketing. That was really in the 60s. It's like, yeah, you probably should step into some of these social issues and at least use your voice occasionally. Then we got CSR, and that addressed the externalities within the company's operations. Purpose is a leap forward. It's basically saying at the heart of your company, at the root of what you do. And if you did it all to the extreme and everything went right, and you reach the full capacity of the company, how do you serve humanity? How do you serve the world? That's purpose to me.
Thank you. Really, so it's at the heart of the organization.
Yes.
And you've been working very closely with BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, who very famously talked about purpose in his 2018-2019 letters to CEOs. What is BlackRock's purpose?
It's a great question, and it's funny, before Larry wrote that letter, we said, hey, we better really lock down our purpose and make sure we're living it, because we're putting the target on our back in many respects by Larry stepping out and saying BlackRock believes that the companies that will prosper long term will have a sense of purpose. So our purpose sounds simple on the surface, but I think it has depth. Our purpose is to help more and more people experience financial well-being. And if you break that down, the more and more people is just the idea that we can include more people in the benefits of saving and investing so that they can live lives that are more fulfilled and live lives of dignity. And so financial inclusion is at the heart of it. not very controversial. Even those who don't believe deeply in purpose will say, I like that part of it because it sounds like more business. There's a commercial piece to it. But we also think it's an experience. It's not just achieving financial well-being. The experience is an ongoing journey of moving along the path. And so having that mindset we thought was important. But financial well-being on its face sounds incredibly simple, and people immediately go, oh, that just means you're doing well financially, or maybe it's better financial futures. We think it has a lot more depth than that. We think on an individual level, it's about moving people along that spectrum. You know, people want to have, first and foremost, a sense of stability, financial stability. You know, can I move from the day-to-day living to having some sense that, you know, I'm going to be okay, to upward mobility, to finally financial security. And if you go way out, financial freedom, and you can get deeper into questions like how much is enough money that someone should have, and what's a healthy relationship with money, but at least get them past stability to upward mobility to financial security. That's just on an individual level. I think financial well-being operates on a community level with groups. We think we play a role there. But here's what BlackRock has, I think very few other companies have. We can operate on a systemic level. You know, we can create transparency. We can use our voice to move the industry toward ideas that we think are more progressive, like climate risk is investment risk, and accelerate investors toward sustainable investing. You know, we can promote things that we believe will not only advance our purpose, but progress society overall.
Great. And so in this letter to shareholders, or sorry, to CEOs, he was really trying to express this influencer role that you have to potentially encourage more organizations to adopt this purpose-driven approach.
100%. I mean, we invest in over 17,000 companies worldwide on the public markets. So we're largest investor in most publicly traded companies. You know, we manage over $7.8 trillion of other people's money. And so that in and of itself gives Larry a certain amount of influence, gives BlackRock a certain amount of influence. And the question is, how should we use that voice? And Rebecca, we could say, you know what, we should remain neutral. We have people on one side who probably feel a certain way. We have people on the other side who probably feel another way. Let's just remain neutral and let the chips fall where they may. I think it's problematic on two levels. And this is why Larry, partly why Larry has taken a stand, beyond the fact that he believes it's the right thing to do. One, that there is no neutral anymore. If you look at the polarization that's happened throughout the world, that polarization's only accelerating primarily because of social media. So even areas that were kind of geographically co-located, so if you're in a city or a town or a village, you used to be able to predict that, you know what, the values will be similar for the most part. You'll have some exceptions, but those will be the outliers. But social media now, within a village, within a town, within the city, has split those polities, and now you can't rely upon that as being a gauge and a proxy for how people think. So that's one. Two, if you remain neutral, both sides in this polarized world will basically say you failed them. And so neutral is probably the worst position to be in. So then the question is, so what position do you take? Finding that center of gravity for a company is critical. And I think purpose is part of that. It's helping the companies discover what's the experienced truth of that company. You know, what's the authentic goal of that company, and using that as a compass to guide the company and to help make those decisions. So those dilemmas get resolved in a way that's consistent with what the company is really about.
And it aligns everyone. Great. Going back a few years before BlackRock, you served as CMO for several years at Pepsi, and Indra Nooyi's focus on performance as purpose was also a big part of this conversation. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because that was back in 2007, probably, and Indra kind of launched that mantra, performance with purpose. And at that time, the idea was we have to perform for the market, but at the same time, we have a sense of purpose to the broader world. And she used primarily the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, as the list from which she would draw kind of inspiration. And so we looked at things like water scarcity and we pulled it in. But it was an early stage of thinking about purpose. Paul Polman was doing something similar at Unilever. And I remember when Indra first launched this, our competitor, Coca-Cola, went the opposite direction, initially, and said, you know what, we hear you. You're going to reduce your sugar footprint and all that's great. We think our products, as is, are actually serving the world in a good way. And our stock got punished. It was a short-term mindset in the marketplace, and our stock got punished for it. But Indra, I think, was right in the sense that the growing expectation from a wide range of stakeholders, starting with employees, but you can move to the communities in which you operate. The expectation was that corporations like PepsiCo, like Unilever, like P&G, would actually do things that would benefit the communities in which they operate. That they would not just be takers, but they would be givers. And so I think she was on the right track, but it was early. But I think the important point is this: purpose has evolved since then. It's no longer just about looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's really looking inward first, bottom up, discovering what your purpose is, making sure it's true, and making sure you can actually live it.
In the long term, yes.
Yeah, for sure.
And how do you measure this? If you're trying to link your company's purpose to these UN development goals, how do you measure your progress toward that?
Yeah,
Is it
I think
possible to do?
that is the most difficult question, and I don't think we have a satisfactory answer to it yet. So it kind of depends on which area you decide to land on in terms of your sense of purpose. If you're Patagonia and you say, we sell outdoor gear, we therefore will make the center of our purpose enhancing and preserving the world in which we live, the environment in which we live. You're probably going to turn to something like SASB or Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and you would say, these are benchmarks and metrics that have been widely accepted, and more companies are aligning behind them. So on the environmental side, there are probably plenty of things you can turn to and use as a metric. But when you get to the social side, it's messy. It's really messy. So when you talk about ESG, the S in ESG, it's a bunch of different things, and this well. It's labor rights. It's wealth inequality. It's racial inequity. It's a bunch of things in there. And so what I would say is you have to land on an area or two that's consistent with your purpose, and then benchmark it in some way. If there's no coalition yet that has set the standard for that particular area, you have to identify what are you doing in the area. So I'll give you an example. If it's about racial inequity or diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are things that every company can do. You can outline your spending across all categories, and you can decide what percentages are going to women, what percentages are going to underrepresented groups, and you can say that's our baseline for today, and pick a percentage of how you might improve from there. So I think we're in that stage of each company is going to have to develop their own benchmarks for this time period. But I know there's work being done to try to create a coalition to make these metrics more consistent across various industries, or at least within industries. And so, but I think that's the big gap within ESG right now is metrics around the S.
Yes, I agree. It's really difficult to make purpose real and meaningful and define it in a way that everyone in the organization understands what it is they're supposed to be doing and knows how to meet these metrics.
100%.
Yes.
Ken Merck used a very general. Ken Merck, who's the CEO of Ken Frazier, who's the CEO of Merck, and he said, "Hey, I just use a very general metric right now because it is all over the place." And I asked the question, "How many people have we helped, and by how much?" And so we identify a group and we say, "How many people have we helped, by how much?" And I think that at first I felt like, wow, that seems incredibly imprecise, incredibly loose, but it's not a bad metric when you think about it. When you start to identify the groups you're trying to serve, and you use some benchmark about where you are today, and then how you can expand that. It could be by the number of people, or by the degree to which you're serving the existing people that are within your constituency.
And it's beautiful because it's simple, right? We
Yes,
can
exactly.
bring people along by having that simplicity and transparency.
Exactly.
Great. So during the COVID pandemic, many organizations are really struggling. Is focusing on purpose a luxury that these struggling organizations can afford right now?
It's interesting. When we first came into the pandemic in the US and in other parts of the world, particularly in Western Europe, um, I heard pretty frequently people say, wow, all those things that we were talking about, purpose, DEI, that's going to all go to the wayside. In fact, there's a recent report today that is saying that that may actually happen as we go into the following year, particularly if we hit an economic recession. But I've actually seen the opposite. And if you think about what the cultural movements that have shaped the world over the past 6 or 7 months, whether it is Black Lives Matter movement, or the very surveys around what people expect of companies and brands coming out of COVID-19, it's been pretty consistent. People have said that we expect companies to do their part. So there's the Edelman study, there's the Gallup Trust survey. They're all saying the same thing. They're asking, is the company doing its part to help us navigate through the crisis and come out on the other side of it, hopefully more stronger, hopefully. So that's one. So I don't think that goes away. But two, there's an additional burden that no one expected, which is this is why I think the S in ESG is going to become the dominant factor. No one expected that related to COVID and beyond COVID-19 are these social issues that have come to the fore. And if you think about it, you're like, why now? I think some of it is because COVID-19 shines a light on the inequities that exist in our healthcare system for certain groups. But I also think it's symbolic of a feeling that has existed for a long time among the larger groups of our population. And that is this feeling that the system is not working for me. The system doesn't see me. The system's not designed to allow me to prosper. And I see only a few people prospering. And the greatest symbol of that disconnect, particularly in the US, is the treatment of Black people within the United States. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, was a wake-up call, not only about what's happening in Black lives, but it's also symbolic, I think, of a deeper anxiety and grievance that people have across the globe. So given that, companies have a choice. They could say, you know what, I want to put purpose on hold during this period of time because these individual problems are so urgent and so important. Let's put it on hold. Let's focus on those things. My view, and Ranjay Gulati and I wrote an article on this recently. My view is that it's the exact time to double down on your purpose, because if you look across those stakeholders, their interests are likely to be very different. Employees versus shareholders versus clients or customers, versus suppliers. And the question you have to ask yourself, especially during a crisis, is how do I unify all those stakeholders?
Mm-hmm.
How do I make sense of that? And purpose can be a compass to unify those stakeholders. It can be the narrative that you use when people say, well, why did you choose option A instead of option B? Or why aren't you helping in certain areas? It gives you that kind of guidance and that confidence that's necessary so that you have the courage to make the leaps that are necessary in times of uncertainty. So I think during a crisis like this, and like COVID-19, it's exactly the time to double down on your purpose and to get more focused on it.
So purpose doesn't change during a crisis. It might even push you toward your core purpose more strongly.
I would hope so. I would hope so.
Interesting. So let's talk about your purpose and your path. You've had a fascinating journey from Motown and Def Jam to co-founding Urban Box Office Networks, and then serving as CMO at Pepsi, BuzzFeed, and BlackRock. What's the common thread?
It's funny. We were talking about this earlier, and I said, I set up in bed one night and decided, let me map out a plan. From entertainment to CPG to financial services. Obviously, that's not the case, but I'll tell you, a pivotal moment for me was my second year in law school. And I traveled over to Russia with an attorney who had been practicing for 20 years. We were representing Atari in the game Tetris because a Russian scientist actually created that game. And then the Russian Copyright Control Office licensed it on an exclusive basis to both Nintendo and Atari. So we fly over there, right? Because so obviously both Nintendo and Atari are holding up these contracts, saying I have the sole right to do this. So we fly over there and we stay for a month. Which was a fascinating experience, which we can talk about at a separate time. But this attorney, his name was Hal Kruth, said to me, he said, "Hey, Frank, I understand you want to teach constitutional law, you want to practice law a little bit. Tell me why you want to do these things." And I gave him all, the reasons why, intellectual stimulation, all that kind of stuff. And he said, after I went through all that, he said, "Okay, look, I've been practicing for over 20 years. I've been in public practice and private practice. And the one thing I would tell you, and this is the only thing I'm going to tell you, is that whatever your personal interests are, the things that energize you in your personal life, that give you a greater sense of fulfillment, you better connect that with your professional life. And you're at the beginning of your career, you can do that, right? So if you do it, what you'll find is that you'll have a greater sense of fulfillment at work. If you don't do it, I can guarantee you, your personal interests will start to go to the wayside increasingly as you get busier, more important. And that divergence will inevitably lead you to less of a sense of fulfillment in your job. You're in the beginning of your career, connect the two things together. And I got to tell you, it was a very difficult process because at that stage, I was like, I'm not really sure. But I went through it and I identified what really inspired me. And it was this idea of helping other people fulfill their potential. That's why I wanted to teach. That's why I went into law initially. And then I thought about the things that I love. I love entertainment and technology. My dad was an electrical engineer. My uncle was a concert promoter and owned a record store and a record label in San Francisco. And it happened to shape me, those two things. So I said, I'll jump into those areas first. And that's where the run at Motown and Def Jam, and later into technology with UBO, et cetera. But I will say this, at every place, that purpose manifested itself in some way for me, that at least for me was a motivating factor. When I was at Motown and Def Jam, they both, to me, created bridges to other people. Motown created the bridge of allowing Black culture to be assimilated into mainstream culture. Berry Gordy's genius was to say, I see this music is powerful, but the way people dress, the way they speak, how they walk across the stage, how we design the songs, we need to modify it a bit so that the mainstream public could accept it and digest it. And he did that. And then it gave us Diana Ross and Smokey Robinson and the Temptations and Marvin Gaye and the Jackson 5, and it became known as the sound of young America in the early days of Motown. Fast forward to Def Jam. Def Jam did exactly the opposite. It said, we're changing nothing. Zero. We're not modifying, adapting, making it acceptable, assimilating. We're going to give it to you straight, uncut. And it was right for that cultural moment, because as people started losing trust in institutions, they were looking for sources that gave them confidence and direction. And what the best of that music did, I won't say all of it, but the best of that music, it gave you a sense of how to overcome struggle. And so again, I feel like both Motown and Def Jam, from different angles, served that purpose. We talked about PepsiCo, BuzzFeed. I felt like took marginalized people who are historically marginalized, put them on center stage. And now at BlackRock, this idea of helping more and more people experience financial well-being. For me, the through line is, at least my personal sense of purpose fits squarely with the purpose and opportunity within each of those companies and industries.
Mm-hmm. And you've talked a lot about the bridging of arts and science. How do you see that happening today?
Some of this I realized recently is probably motivated by my own background. I mentioned that my dad was an electrical engineer. My uncle was closest to me, was a concert promoter. Like the art and science kind of was always with me. But I just think we're in a special moment in time where, particularly in marketing, you think about marketing its heyday, you think of the Mad Men. If anyone who's seen that show, it's like, hey, can I come up with a brilliant idea? Really super creative, get people motivated, get them to laugh. 30-second commercial, my job is done. Off to a 2-martini lunch. right? And so so that was a moment in time. That was the art side, and some people think of it that way. Increasingly, as marketing moved into the C-suite, the CFO in particular, but oftentimes the CEO was asking the question, but explain to me in quantitative terms, how you're delivering value, like in quantitative terms. Don't give me the mumbo jumbo of marketing and storytelling. Tell me in quantitative terms. And that introduced this whole idea of performance marketing. And so people went to what they call the bottom of the funnel and started looking at how can I acquire more customers, how can I minimize customer acquisition costs? How can I maximize the lifetime value of the customer? It's purely data-driven, bottom of the funnel activity. So the mad men were replaced by the mad scientists, and this internecine war kind of kicked off between the two. And it looked like at one point the mad scientists were going to win, but then the mad men came back with their storytelling. I think we're in a moment in time now where the two things can work together. And the greatest lesson I learned from BuzzFeed was not about the listicles, was not about the cat videos or exploding watermelon videos. It was not Tasty, which is a big food channel. It was the system that they put in place. And the system that they put in place is they would put a creator right next to a data scientist physically, and they would work together to iterate the content. How do you frame it? Who's the lead character? What's the headline? Where do we put it? In what context? And you're constantly iterating, and it was fascinating to see, because sometimes things just didn't work at first, but you make one small shift based on the data, and suddenly it takes off. And I think we're in that moment now where the art and the science can come together. Storytelling and data, experience design and kind of quantitative analysis of a customer journey. So this is a great moment, I think, for anyone in business, but in marketing in particular, if you embrace both the art and the science.
Very interesting. And how would you advise students? That might be certainly one industry to think about, but how would you advise students to choose opportunities and chart their path toward purpose as they navigate the career decisions in front of them?
So I would say, number one, I would look at companies. For me, it's always companies that want to change, want to grow, and want to lead the change. That's first and foremost for me. I think the danger I've seen is any company, particularly if it's a dominant company, that wants to hold on to the status quo, doesn't want things to change. It's usually only a matter of time before their demise, right? Because what we do know is the outside world is changing, and the gap between the kind of the constant, the static nature of the inside of a company versus the change outside the company, eventually that will lead to the company's demise. So I would look for companies, leadership that embrace change. That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, I look at companies that really respect and embrace and practice diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the reason I say that is because, for me, that is a signal about the level of empathy within the company. Because no matter who you are, what your background is, if you want to develop as a person, you want to develop your career, you need managers that have some empathy, that know how to ask questions humbly, that listen with intent to understand. And DEI, if it's done the right way, is one of the signals around that. But the third thing I would say is that take some of the responsibility yourself to craft your own experience and to extract the best out of your own experience. You can come into any situation and at any company, at any level, in any job, and you can see all the negatives in it. Or you can come into any company, any situation, and any job and extract extraordinary value out of it that is transferable. And so for me, if you're starting your career, you're gonna have many jobs, probably across many industries. Like, what I've done was highly unusual for my contemporaries. I would say going forward, it's not going to be unusual. People will work across many jobs and likely multiple industries throughout their careers. 50% of the people born today will work in industries that haven't even been created, right? So what does that mean to me? To me, that means not only do you have to remain curious and learn continuously, but you should develop transferable skills. And the way to develop transferable skills to me is to think about your job and the role and what you're learning in a way that's expansive. So I'll give you an example. So someone could say, well, Motown seems so far away from BlackRock. But I'll tell you some of the lessons I learned from Motown. One of the lessons I learned at Motown when I looked at and Def Jam, when I looked at the very best of people, and Pepsi too, actually, because I did a lot of music at Pepsi.
Mhm.
People who are at the very best within music industry, within entertainment broadly, they chose mastery over fame. The very best. So what does that mean? They actually honed their craft first, continuously tried to be the best at it, and then fame followed that, as opposed to working on fame first and then trying to master something. The very best often were introverts. So I learned about the power of introverts. And you might see you take someone like a Beyonce, right? The Beyonce on stage, you look at her, you're like, oh my God, Beyonce is the most extroverted person I've ever seen. She's so incredibly connected, and she can project energy in ways that could never imagine myself. But in reality, Beyonce is an introvert. She gets energy from being alone. You might say she's a little bit on the shy side, but I see that pretty consistently. And so I learned about the power of introverts. I learned about resilience. I've seen many people who, those who lasted, were always tested at some point. And the question is, do you have the resilience to withstand that test? All these are lessons that I can apply going forward. If you go to PepsiCo, I learned about the power of community. I ran a brand called Mountain Dew, which is kind of a crazy brand for me to run, because if you know the history of Mountain Dew, by the way, is a euphemism for moonshine. Okay? It was created in the hills of Tennessee. And it was supposed to be a mixer for moonshine during the Prohibition era, right? And so if you look at the geographic footprint of Mountain Dew, it's Midwest to South of the United States primarily. And so when I ran that brand, what I learned, when I saw online, people were getting tattoos of Mountain Dew, they had Christmas trees made of Mountain Dew, they just loved the brand. We said, well, what if we activated that community? And we got that community through an online game. We have them design the next Mountain Dew drink. They create the ingredients, the flavor, the color, the name, even the marketing plan around it, and it became the most successful limited time offering in PepsiCo's history. And then it became a permanent drink in its portfolio. But the power of community, I apply that right here at BlackRock as I think about financial advisors, as I think about investors. And so the point is that no matter your job, you can tease out lessons and build transferable skills that you can apply not only within the company you're at today, but you can take with you to other places. And I think that's going to be the key unlock for most people, those transferable skills, always looking forward to what's coming next. And some of those things I think should be obvious to people what's happening, but maybe not. But I think, understanding data, understanding kind of machine learning and reinforcement learning is absolutely important. Knowing how to tell a story will be critically important. Building empathic skills. How do you really put yourself in the shoes of others so you can understand, what they're thinking and feeling? Those are skills that are transferable that I think everyone will need to build.
Very wise to see these connections. So we have a lot of questions from our audience. I'd like to give our audience time to ask these. Let me start by giving you one. Someone starts off saying you're considered one of the most creative businessmen. How do you stay creative? How do you promote creativity in your workplace?
The way I've tried to stay creative and continue to try to stay creative is twofold. One, I believe in continuous learning. I really do. So I read a lot. I talk to a lot of people. I study areas that are adjacent to my core area. I rarely read a marketing book, rarely. And I'm not saying don't read marketing books, but I rarely read one because it's the other ideas that spark my interest. For example, I may read Jeffrey West, who's a physicist. He wrote a book called Scale, and he talks about how cities scale, how organisms scale, and what we can learn in businesses about this about scale, right? Or I might read about purpose, or I'm always reading into something adjacent and pulling it back in, and so that continuous learning, lateral learning, lots of reading. You can watch documentaries, whatever it is that the way you learn. I think that's absolutely critical. Second thing that I've done is I try to maintain a diverse group of contacts and relationships across industries, across disciplines, across age groups, across geographies, and for me, I learn an incredible amount that way. Much of what I do is synthesizing kind of what I hear and what I see and what people are telling me, and connecting those dots from those conversations have been, for me, absolutely critical.
Right, and continuous learning and engagement. It's great. So we have another question. An entertainment lawyer is very different from a CMO. Why did you transition careers, and what were some of the challenges that you met while you were transitioning? You mentioned the why, but this is more about the how.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. So, being a lawyer and being trained as a lawyer versus being a marketer is not as different as you might think, right? So, in both cases, what you're trying to do is persuade people. In both cases, lawyers come at it through a really formal, logical process. Like the whole kind of syllogistic reasoning. From basic premises, et cetera. Marketers tend to come at it from more of an inductive approach. They're learning about people and teasing out insights, but they're both really trying to persuade you at the end of the day. And so I find that skill set really helpful coming from as being a lawyer. Second thing I think law teaches you is how to solve problems. And I would say every single day, multiple times a day, there's a problem that comes my way. How do you solve the problem? How do you think about it? How do you organize it in a way so that others can understand it? So it's helpful in that respect. But there were some fundamental changes I had to make. I'd say particularly as a corporate lawyer and a transactional lawyer and an entertainment lawyer, you're not making the final decision most of the time. You're giving people options, and you might recommend something, but ultimately the final decision is someone else's, and they need to live and die by that decision, and you gave them advice for it. It's very different when you have to make the decision and you have to live by it. And so that's one leap that I think was different. The second is that as a lawyer, and this is something that took me a long time to shed, you're always looking in the shadows, like what could go wrong? What are the danger signs? Well, if you cross that street there, you could get hit by a car. You're always thinking about risk, danger, and how to mitigate that and cover it. As a business leader, you have to think about risk for sure. You need to understand risk, but you don't get anywhere unless you make a leap. You're going to have to leap at some point. You can gather all the information that you want to gather. You can get all the opinions that you want to get, but at some point you will have to leap. And oftentimes that's coming from another place. It's not an intellectual place. It's an intuitive space that comes from. And rediscovering that for me was something that was important to do, but it was difficult at first because as a lawyer, I was constantly looking at the negative side of it. So that was an important change for me.
So leaping and being responsible for that leap.
Yeah.
So are there challenges you face in your current role that are analogous to those you faced in the entertainment industry?
It's very different, I gotta say, in terms of the challenges. So think about it this way. My 90% of my career has been about understanding what's happening in culture, bringing that back into an industry, and then finding an authentic position for the company. 90% of what I've done, including at PepsiCo, looking at what's happening in culture and whether it's a new generation, whether it's music videos, whether it's a technology, whether it's a cultural movement. And then I would look at that and say, how does that play within the beverage industry or with brands? And what can Pepsi, based on what it does in its history, how can it have a differentiated position against that? The financial services industry, and this asset management and BlackRock in particular doesn't come from that space. In fact, it comes from the space of kind of the pure economics perspective, which is that there's rational decisions made by rational people within a marketplace, and there is the cultural setting has little bearing on that. And so and that has worked to a certain extent for many decades. And so for here, the difficulty is we're in that transition period where many people have kind of awakened to the fact that maybe the Milton Friedman doctrine was wrong, that we should serve more than the shareholders. People are awakening to the fact that, wow, actually culture does affect financial services. Whether people have access to the benefits of investing and saving, do they have the knowledge and skills? Are we spreading financial literacy in ways that enhance them, their capability? Are we thinking about the effect of shifting away from pension plans, which give people a salary for life, to 401ks, which means you're on your own? We're responsible for these things, and they come out of culture and they affect culture. And so to me, it's more of the difficulty here is more of the increasing exposure and understanding of how the cultural dimension affects financial services. And if anything, the thing that excites me about it, though, is that I feel like it's like a renaissance in a way, where you kind of rediscover the values of the past. I feel like we're rediscovering what this is all about in the first place. Before the financialization of the world, there was this idea that the reason we're doing this is so that we can improve the lives of people, so that society can thrive, and so that we can live in a world that actually survives, right? And so if you really think about it that way, it's a rediscovery of that. But I think opening up that cultural lens is something unfamiliar to the financial services industry as a whole, and including BlackRock. And that's probably been my most difficult challenge.
And so important. That relates closely to the next question. What are some of the trends that have been accelerated by the pandemic in the asset management industry? And what if things don't go back to normal?
I can almost guarantee, but I'll put a small wager on it that things will never return to what we consider to be normal. Won't happen. Because I think some things have encouraged a permanent shift. And I'll start with some of the smaller things. The shift to e-commerce and digital, I think, is permanent. Those who were the late adopters, those who are the most recalcitrant, who said, I'm never going to join, they're in because they have to be in. They're ordering online and they're getting much better at it. And so I think that shift is going to happen. At BlackRock, one of the key shifts for us is the shift to virtual events. We thought, oh my God, this is going to be disastrous, because we build relationships by hosting these live events, and the interaction of people in person, I think, remains important. But we learned a lot about what you can do in a virtual environment. You can host a truly global event in the virtual environment. You can't really do that in person. In a virtual environment, you can. You can get speakers that you might not otherwise be able to get, because now you say, I need a half an hour of your time. And if you want, you can stay in your pajamas on the bottom, just put on a jacket on top if you want. We don't care. And so there's this enormous opportunity around virtual events. And I'll tell you, it's going to accelerate. I think we're at the very beginning stages of what a virtual event should look like and what the experience should be. So I think you'll see that will continue to accelerate. I think that there's a greater awareness now that, and there's been a lot of hype around this, but machine learning and reinforcement learning will be extraordinarily useful for personalization. And that, as we're moving more toward this digital space and COVID-19 is accelerating that, people are asking for better personalization. Like, I think some of the personalization that's been promised to us is not that good. I don't know how many people here watch Netflix. I watch way too much Netflix myself. But I can tell you their personalization engine is not very good for me, because every time I go on there, I can spend an hour and find nothing that they recommend for me that makes sense for me at all. Maybe it's their catalog, I don't know. But we can get better, all of us, at personalization. I think you're going to see that. But here's the thing that I think is deeper than all of that. What COVID-19 has done, and this pandemic and this lockdown, it's forced us all to think about what is truly essential. Like, what's essential to us? What's important? We had to slow down. We can't run around. I'm not flying around the world anymore. People are sitting in front of their phones and their computers and the TV. We had to slow down, and it's forced you to think about what's essential. It's forced you to think about each other. And so I think one of the outcomes of this, and one of the permanent shifts, will be a greater awareness of who we are now and who we can become as a people overall. And so I think that those who understand that shift and really participate in it will, one, do a great service to the world. Will, two, I think have a great sense of personal fulfillment. But three, I think they'll find that their role will be valuable to many, many people. And I'll tell you, and Paul kind of started with this. I think Georgetown is in a particularly useful spot in this. The Jesuit training about caring holistically for people. That's the moment we're in right now, where people are expecting that, and they're expecting people and companies and brands to serve them in ways that give them greater opportunity, that improves their lives, that give them a sense of hope, and those that do that, I think, will become the iconic brands of the future, and the companies that thrive long term. And so, I think everyone on this call, everyone at Georgetown, the training and the underlying philosophy of the university. There's never been a better time in recent history that I'm aware of where that applies in business and meets the needs of people across the globe.
And just to follow up on that, one of the trends we have been seeing is increasing income disparity. How does purpose help to address this problem?
So not every single company will speak to income inequality, wealth inequality, inequality based on race. Not every single company will address it. Like I'll go back to Patagonia, they should address it as part of what they do, but they'll probably focus more on environmental sustainability because it's at the heart of what they do. But a company like BlackRock or any other asset manager or an investment manager, or a pension fund, for them not to address inequality, I think will be a failure of the fiduciary duty to humankind, right? And so, to me, our purpose speaks directly to it. Not everyone's purpose has to do it. Our purpose is about including more people. When we say we help more and more people experience financial well-being, at the heart of that, we're saying those who feel like they are not progressing, those who feel like they don't have the knowledge and skills, those who feel like they don't have access for upward mobility, we want to include more of them in our expertise. We want to develop more products for them. We want to get beyond the 1%, the 10%, even the 20%, and we think we have an opportunity to do that. So I think some companies like BlackRock will be at the center of it. But I think every company in every community in which you operate has to realize that growing inequality creates such an underlying tension within the community that ultimately the community will not be sustainable. And so the ultimate form of sustainability is making sure that people feel like they're in it together. And you cannot feel like you're in it together if you have such a wide gap. And you know all the stats, 50 of the wealthiest people in the world have more assets than the whole half of humanity, right? And so something about that doesn't feel quite right. And so I think the outcries that we're seeing where people are saying, let's reimagine capitalism, let's reshape capitalism. Some are calling it ethical capitalism, some are calling it conscious capitalism, whatever name you want to choose, it's all saying the same thing, which is that the entire system has to shift in a way that that includes more people and gives greater opportunity. So I see this as being above individual purpose and being more systemic. And so I think every company and every person in some way should address it. And the last thing I'll say, Rebecca, I know it's a long answer, is that the one of the overlays to that is race in the U.S. It's different in different parts of the world, depending on where you are. It could be Moroccans in France, it could be the untouchables in India. But anyone that's excluded, anyone that's been separated, I think we're in the moment in time where we're trying to figure out how do we move forward together. And I think companies play a role in that. Government needs to play a role in that. NGOs need to play a role in that because this fragmentation is not sustainable.
Absolutely. So, we have lots more questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but there are a few related to this, like a question, can you talk about BlackRock's emergency savings initiative? That seems like a way to start getting at some of these problems in a tactical way.
Yeah. So look, Deborah Winchell runs our social impact group, and she came over from the Robin Hood Foundation, and she applied a lot of the principles from the Robin Hood Foundation here, which I think is fantastic. And the Emergency Savings Initiative, what really was spurred by that key fact I think everyone saw a year and a half to 2 years ago, which is that the vast majority of people have less than $400 in savings in case of an emergency. So one emergency can send someone kind of really into a tragic financial situation, one small emergency. And so our thought was, if you look across that spectrum again of stability to upward mobility to security, stability being the first step, you have to have savings first and foremost. And so the Emergency Savings Initiative was really our way of using our voice and our power to try to create that foundation, but to spur others. Because when you talk about these kind of problems, no one company can solve it by themselves. You need a coalition, and not just a coalition of the willing, the coalition of the committed to jump in with you, right? They have to come in with you because no one can solve it alone. So that's what the Emergency Savings Initiative is about. I'll say one last thing is I also sit on the board of Acorns, which is a fintech company, and the foundation of Acorns is very similar to that same notion. The foundation of Acorns is helping people save first before they invest. They round up, if you're spending money in shopping, they round up to the next dollar and put that money into a savings platform. So that's one of the key things that unlocks, we think, to move people along the path of financial well-being: savings first and then investing second.
Thank you so much, Frank, for this enlightening discussion and for taking all of our questions. Really appreciate you being open to the variety of questions that we've brought to you, and loved hearing about the purpose-driven mission of both BlackRock and Pepsi and the other organizations you've been part of. So thank you so much for your
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And I hope so someday soon I can come down and we can see everyone in person. I'd love to see everyone's faces and have the energy of an in-person experience. But thank you so much for inviting me.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.